So with Exandria Unlimited complete and Campaign 3 of Critical Role just starting out, I have something I just desperately want to talk about from Campaign 2 of Critical Role. And no, I promise this is not just an excuse for me to talk about my favorite character for a few hours while I record this. Though the shrine I made for him is pretty nice. I don't know how well you can see it all right now because of the sun, but I'm enjoying the shrine behind me. I will eventually have to take this down and be an adult about it. But for right now, this is my favorite video background I've ever put together. Anyway, today I'm talking about a redemption arc that can rival some of the better arcs in the history of storytelling, and this one was entirely improv'd. Oh my god. Finally starting is a whole lot. Oh yeah, major spoiler warning for Critical Role Campaign 2. I feel like that was assumed. I should probably put this at the beginning. Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jess, and to start us off, I'm going to discuss what Critical Role actually is because I think we need some context before I get too into this. If you don't know, Critical Role is an actual play D&D live stream that started on the Geek and Sundry Twitch channel and has since become its own Twitch channel and is quickly becoming a powerhouse of D&D actual play content. Now, what is an actual play? Well, that's simple. It's a game that's played live or pre-recorded where the cast sits down and plays a tabletop role-playing game, aka a TTRPG, without cutting or editing anything out. So in the most basic way, they're actually playing the game right there in front of you, which is why it's called an actual play. Whether it be live streamed on Twitch, recorded and made into a podcast, or recorded and then placed on YouTube, all of these formats are considered actual plays. I've actually been in several at this point and have also GM'd a few, so this isn't something that requires a large company or set to be able to do. And with so many people playing TTRPGs virtually, it seems like it's becoming more and more common for people to stream their games just because they can. And honestly, it's fun. I have a lot of fun with it. Check out the Knights of the Bantam channel if you want to see either of the actual plays I have GM'd. Anyway, Critical Role in particular got its start on Geek and Sundry as a live stream and transitioned into doing pre-recorded games during the pandemic to be able to accommodate the safety regulations required. That being said, the games are still entirely unscripted, and it's not unlike watching an improv performance, just with the format of playing a TTRPG on top of it. This is an aspect I find personally very interesting since I like to write compelling narratives, play TTRPGs, and I'm dabbling in streaming and improv myself. I'm emphasizing the improv nature of these actual play shows because I think it's an important part of what I'm going to talk about throughout this essay. The cast of Critical Role essentially wrote the most compelling redemption story I've seen in media in years, basically because of a few snap decisions early on in the campaign, and ultimately just because they thought this one NPC was really cool. An NPC is a non-player character, not unlike the characters you interact with in a video game. They're all run by the GM in TTRPGs. So if you've watched Campaign 2 of Critical Role, you've probably figured out what I'm talking about already, but for those of you who are maybe just watching this video because, I don't know, you thought it sounded interesting, first of all, thank you. And second of all, the character I'm about to talk about is the Shadow Hand Essek of Thelyss. But first, I think we need to discuss how redemption arcs work and when they work well versus when they do not. I am intentionally dressed like Caleb for this, by the way. I'm really into this little harnessy guy I bought. I'm going to keep this section as brief as I possibly can because I could probably write an entire video about it, but what makes a redemption arc in a story work? Well, there are lots of ways that a redemption arc can work, but I do think there are some core components of what makes a good one versus what makes a bad one. First, redemption arcs have to move from point A to point B somehow. And usually this is done on the crux of realization. That realization typically being that the character in the process of being redeemed must have a moment of discovery which causes them to change how they're acting for whatever reason. A really good example of this is Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender. While Zuko doesn't have a linear path from must redeem my honor and get my father to accept me to the Fire Nation is in the wrong and I need to help the Avatar, he certainly has moments of realization that cause him to move from point A to point B. Without moments like when he and Katara are discussing the fact that they've both lost their mothers to the Fire Nation, that he was descended not only from Fire Lord Ozai, but Avatar Roku, and even that his uncle was the only paternal figure in his life who truly cared about him as a person, Zuko's redemption arc wouldn't feel nearly as satisfying and also wouldn't make a lot of sense narratively. I'd say an example of a less satisfying but still pretty good redemption is Piccolo in the Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z series. He basically only ends up redeemed because he merges forms with Kami and gains some of his thoughts and feelings. While Piccolo's relationship with Gohan ends up being a big part of his arc, there's less of that internal realization that makes it feel satisfying. Which brings me to my second point, actually. I'd argue that a lot of the change needs to happen internally, and while the catalyst can be an outside force, it's the internal journey that really matters in a redemption arc. It's not a redemption arc when a character suddenly decides to do the right thing one time, when to the audience there hasn't been any internal change at all. I'd argue that this is why Count Olaf in A Series of Unfortunate Events, 2017, isn't an example of a redemption arc while he technically does the right thing at the very end of the story. There was never any internal change to his character, and I think that the show also does a really good job of making it clear that he wasn't redeemed. Given the way the kids don't try to pretend like he wasn't a bad person at the end, and they give him a basically completely unfeeling funeral where they just kind of bury him, it's a pretty good indication that he wasn't redeemed, he just kind of did the right thing once. And third, I think there's an element of character agency that we need to discuss. In examples like Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender, Zuko is in control of himself and his actions, but they're all colored by his history as an abuse victim. From incredibly early on in the series, it's established that Zuko has been manipulated, emotionally and physically abused by his father, and sees himself as inferior to his younger sister Azula. These parts of his character not only make Zuko sympathetic in a way that makes him capable of redemption to the audience, it also makes him lack a certain level of agency early on to be better than he is. As it stands, Zuko at the beginning of the series is just doing the best that he can with what he has. I think these reasons all also make the writing more compelling as the series goes on, and Zuko wavers on his feelings towards his father, the Fire Nation, Azula, the Avatar, and his own personal being. The thing is I don't think a character needs to be young or a victim of abuse to be worthy of redemption, but I think some element where their agency is stripped or they were acting on incorrect information, propaganda, or in response to long-held emotional struggles can make their actions more forgivable to the audience. At the very least, this makes redemption arcs more compelling, even if they don't necessarily need to be there to make them happen. An example of this sort of thing written poorly is Snape from the Harry Potter series. Snape is an allegorical Nazi who basically only stops being one because Lily's life is threatened. There's not an internal struggle over his worldviews and no realization that the Death Eaters are wrong, and no internal realization that being a Death Eater is wrong, just that Lord Voldemort is going to kill the woman that he's in love with. His supposed redemption is then also further tarnished by the fact that he, as an adult, essentially repeatedly treats Harry badly and abuses him for the crimes of looking like his dad? Which he frankly just didn't have to do and as an adult should have known better. There was an attempt to make him sympathetic that just didn't work. And again, while I don't think these elements are necessary for a redemption arc, they can make or break the writing on one. Sorry to all the Snape wives out there. Anyway, if you have personal attachments to Snape from reading the books when you were young, you have to admit that this is not a well set up redemption arc. So those are what I think are some of the key components of redemption arcs. And with that out of the way, let's get back to Critical Role and Essek. So to bring you up to speed on Essek as a character, I need to give you a quick rundown of how the main characters of Campaign 2 of Critical Role met him. Critical Role of Campaign 2 in particular follows the Mighty Nine, a group of wayward adventurers who come together to do a multitude of things throughout the story, from saving a bunch of people from being eaten by gnolls to all out saving the world from an eldritch flesh monster made from a portion of an ancient city of mages. No, I'm not making that up. The original party consists of Jester Lavore, Ford, Bo, Yasha, Caleb Widowgast, Mollymauk Tealeaf, and Not the Brave. Later on in the story, Caduceus Clay joins after Mollymauk is unfortunately killed. Also, at one point, Not the Brave turns back into her true self, Veth Branato. It's still the same character, but I'll explain more about that later. What kicked all of this off and set the Mighty Nine on a path towards meeting Essek was an early decision made by the party where they could have either worked with the government of the Dwendalian Empire just as a war started between the Empire and the neighboring Kryn dynasty. The party unequivocally chose crime and instead decided to do some work for an NPC named the Gentleman who ran a crime syndicate in Zadash, a large city that the party was promptly fleeing so that they didn't have to get involved in the war. A large number of shenanigans, the death of Mollymock, and an entire arc spent as pirates on the high seas, and they received the news that the Kryn dynasty had attacked a city called Felderwind in the central part of the Empire. This prompted one of the player characters, not the brave, to panic and insist that they go to Felderwind to check on the people she knew there. Upon arriving, the party finds out that Not, whose name is actually Veth Bernardo, had a husband who was an alchemist and a young son before she was cursed and turned into a goblin. After confirming that her son was safe, the party discovered that her husband had been taken to the dynasty. This leads the party into the caverns left over by the massive purple worms the Kryn dynasty soldiers used to travel into the Empire. They follow the path deep underground and end up in the dynasty. After a quick fight with some remaining Kryn soldiers, the party follows a few different plot threads which have been left in place by the DM until they end up in the capital city of Rosanna in front of the Bright Queen who rules over the dynasty. Party makes an attempt to half-lie to the Bright Queen in hopes of getting Veth's husband back, only to have a soldier that was sent with them speak up and explain that the party had attacked the Kryn soldiers when they first arrived. Things start to go south, and in a desperate attempt to protect his friends and extend an olive branch, party's wizard, Caleb Widowgast, who is played by Liam O'Brien, offers up an artifact that the party came upon in Zadash that they knew was important to the Kryn dynasty. This artifact is what's known as a Luxon beacon, which is, according to the people of the dynasty, a piece of their god and incredibly sacred. Fun fact, it would look something like this, this gem that I have in here. This is supposed to light up. I made this yesterday, and I got it all ready for filming today, and it didn't work, so I'm showing it to you guys because I'm frustrated. But yeah, it's like shaped like a D12, for those of you who do play TTRPGs. And it kind of looks like a piece of like smoky quartz, which is what this is. But yeah, these things are incredibly sacred to the people of the dynasty, and like I said, they truly believe that they are a portion of their god. This results in the party getting in the good graces of the Bright Queen, at which point they are introduced to Essek Thelyss, who is going to sort of be their chaperone in the dynasty. People of the dynasty all live within dens, so Essek of Den Thelyss, meaning his last name is Thelyss. Now, the audience doesn't know at the moment this all initially goes down, but Essek is actually the reason the party has the Luxon beacon. Because he stole it and gave it to the worst wizards in existence, the Cerberus Assembly, who work for the dynasty's #1 enemy, the Dwendalian Empire. Now, I want to say right here that there's a lot of debate about whether or not Essek stealing the beacon was the catalyst for the war. My interpretation of this was that the war would probably have happened regardless of Essek stealing the beacon. Not only has Matt Mercer, the game master for the series, heavily implied that these two countries would have been at each other's throats and looking for a reason to fight, he also wrote a D&D source book for the setting that they were playing in called The Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, where he basically says the same thing. In fact, he literally describes it as a powder keg about to explode. I also want to pause here and say that there's a description of Essek in this book, which gives us a potential look into what Matt Mercer was considering him to be like when he's introduced in the campaign. Though I think that parts of Essek's characterization changed rather quickly due to the way that the party decided to interact with him, which I'll get to in a moment. This does feel largely true to who he was when the party first meets him. For example, there's no doubt that Essek knew stealing the beacon could result in the dynasty attacking the Empire and innocent lives being lost. Once we contextualize these early scenes with Essek after finding out he stole the beacon, we basically learned that he stepped up to work with the party almost entirely to cover his own ass. It's clear that some of the things he says and does are to manipulate them. Not really into doing anything, but rather to send them looking in the other direction. The thing is that one of the main characters in the party, Bo, played by Marisha Ray, is a member of the Cobalt Soul. The Cobalt Soul kind of acts as a free agent slash spy network throughout the world they're in. Like, I think it's like the whole world, not just the Empire and the Dynasty. Basically, the Cobalt Soul looks for and uproots corruption wherever they are, but being from the Empire, that's primarily what Bo is looking into with the help of her contacts with the organization. They kind of act like a sort of neutral check for the Cerberus Assembly, who are the worst wizards ever that I mentioned before, as well as the king himself. Because of Bo's ties to the Cobalt Soul, the party is pretty sure that there are traitors to the Dynasty and the Empire high in the ranks of both countries, meaning that they kind of know that someone has to be the traitor, so most of Essek's manipulation of the party is just to make sure they don't realize that it's him. For example, at one point he talks about having been consecrated, which is a sacred ritual and part of the worship of the beacon. However, Matt Mercer later revealed that this wasn't actually true and that Essek had lied about it, and then in the post-campaign wrap-up, he explained it was because Essek was trying to divert their attention and appear as normal a part of the Bright Queen's court as possible. This also means that a lot of what happens to Essek is the Mighty Nine's fault. Not that he didn't deserve it, it just means that it's kind of their fault. Or they were the ones who caused it. Now, with all of that context in place, we need to talk about how the party interacted with Essek, because that's a big part of how his redemption arc wound up being so well done. To really understand how we got from...
Do we have to kill you to get him out of here?
I'd like to see you try. No. I get to decide.
To...
And he's like, he does that and looks over and sees the guy and goes like, well,
No.
kind of drifts into the corner with his fists up, looking over towards you, Caleb, and kind of caduces around the corner. He's like, trust.
Honestly, Laura Bailey is truly the person we need to thank here. That's where I want to start this section off. Anyway, Jester Lavore, played by Laura Bailey, is largely the reason we got to see Essek have a redemption arc. Now, I will say the entire party was interested in Essek, but Jester in particular was determined to be his friend and consistently maintained that Essek was their friend and would be allied to the party, even after they discovered that he was a traitor. In fact, Jester did this with a lot of characters, but I think with Essek it was just particularly comical. On top of that, Jester was the player character that primarily got into contact with the NPCs when the party needed it, because she had this spell called Sending, which she abused greatly. Essek was often on the receiving end of this for a lot of reasons. I think both because Jester had decided she was going to be Essek's friend whether he liked it or not, but also because he was their main contact in the dynasty, and frankly, she succeeded. There's a lot of small moments where it's clear that Essek seems to genuinely like Jester, even if he finds her sort of frustrating at times. But I think scenes like Jester making Essek a parasol using some magic paint that she had is a pretty good example of this. They were standing out on a sunny beach, and Essek is a drow, meaning the sunlight isn't very comfortable for him to be in, and Jester uses a really high-priced and powerful magic item just to make sure that he's somewhat comfortable for the 5 minutes that he's standing there with them. Jester genuinely cares about Essek as a person, and I feel like it's especially from this moment forward that Essek really softens to the group overall. Now, the rest of the party seem to genuinely enjoy Essek's presence, though. I don't want to downplay that at all, but it's after this scene with the parasol that he starts to acknowledge them as people he at the very least hopes will stay safe from here on out, and while he often isn't willing to go with them, he does seem to care and want to help them, even if they're incredibly inconvenient to him and even sometimes too wrapped up in what they're doing to thank him for his help. Gonna bring up that moment where in the description of Essek where it says that he wants to practice the darker elements of dunamancy, yet he does not want to travel with the adventurers. This will become important later. However, Essek was already building friendships with the rest of the Mighty Nine at this point. It's just not as clear-cut. Particularly, Caleb and Essek form a fairly close friendship from early on in their interactions. For one thing, Essek seems to at least recognize Caleb as a peer. While Essek is much further along in his learning of magic when he meets Caleb, Essek always treats Caleb as a kind of almost like a fellow smart kid in class. That sounds weird, but Essek recognizes Caleb's talent and skill in magic and actually ends up teaching him a few powerful spells, which sort of become a big part of Caleb's character throughout the campaign. And while in ways Essek acts like a teacher to Caleb early in their friendship, Essek also very much treats Caleb like someone he can equally learn from, and we eventually see that happening. In fact, I think Essek being probably the only good teacher that Caleb has ever had in his entire life is a significant reason why Caleb comes to trust him. The second reason Essek and Caleb become good friends is actually related to Veth. Caleb and Veth, played by Sam Riegel, knew each other prior to the events of the campaign and were best friends. Part of Caleb's goals in the campaign were to help Veth turn back into a halfling, since she had been cursed to be a goblin. Caleb ends up getting a hold of a half-finished spell, which can turn Veth back if it's finished, and he actually goes to Essek to help him finish it. They're able to do this, and eventually, after they get the actual curse lifted, Caleb turns Veth back into a halfling because of it. I think you can see already a kind of running theme of the player characters forming fairly deep personal connections with Essek, which resulted in him becoming a good friend. Whether it was sharing knowledge with Caleb, Jester trying to figure out if he walks or floats, or even Bo lovingly antagonizing him, Essek became friends with the party. Also, I'm realizing I did not mention that Essek does not walk, he floats, which was a big draw for him early on with the party members.
Also, that guy, he can't float.
And by party members, I mostly mean, like, the player characters. Like, they really wanted to know if he walked or floated. Also, the party's nickname for him was Hot Boy. I feel like him being attractive was a really big part of why they wanted to keep him around. Also, around this time in the story, they convince Essek to come over for dinner, which results in all of them sitting in a hot tub. Don't ask. Anyway, they convince Essek to come over for dinner, and they earnestly get to know him as a person. He talks a bit about how he doesn't really believe in the religion surrounding the Luxon, and cares more about studying Dunamancy, the magic associated with the beacons. Essek even discusses how his father died, and how he has serious regrets about the fact that they were fighting just before his death in this scene. And this is one of the first times we get a glimpse of Essek really seeing the party as friends. And honestly, it's pretty clear from this scene that they're probably some of the only friends that he has. Which honestly just makes it so much worse when they discover that he was the traitor that gave the beacons to the Cerberus Assembly. And welcome back. Look, I got the beacon out of the jar this time. This is the Essek outfit, by the way. I'm very, very pleased with it. Everyone on TikTok kept saying that I looked like Janis Joplin in it, and I love that. Okay, anyway, all the fun stuff out of the way. I have to provide a bit more context around the story at this point, so please bear with me. Basically, the Mighty Nine had been trying to stop the war between the Dynasty and the Empire. They had managed to prove at this point that there were third parties as well as traitors on both sides that were trying to incite incidents in both courts. So they got both the Dynasty and the Empire to agree to a negotiation on neutral territory. But because they're D&D players, the Mighty Nine convinced the Bright Queen that they had to be at this meeting, so she allowed them to come along, and because they were meeting at sea to be in a neutral spot, the party traveled to Nicodranus, a neighboring country which wasn't involved in the war, but was allied with the Empire at the time. They did this so they could get back on their boat and make their rendezvous. Remember I mentioned they were pirates for like a good while? It was while they were in Nicodranus meeting with the Cerberus Assembly members, because remember the Cerberus Assembly is part of the government of the Empire, even if they are the worst wizards in the world. While they're doing this, they meet an elven man who seems nervous around them, which sets off alarms for a few of the characters that he might be lying to them or something. Of course, this elven man is Essek in disguise, which is why he's acting weird. He didn't realize that they were going to be there, so he kind of freaked out. More than kind of. Anyway, Caleb happened to send his familiar after the Martinet Ludinus Deleth, a member of the Cerberus Assembly. This resulted in one of the most dramatic reveals to ever happen in the campaign.
To which the revealed Essek responds. Of course I am uncomfortable with this. I did not know they were going to be coming directly here. And when this business is behind us, we need not interact ever again. The Assembly will share its research for the deal and beyond, and we never have to speak. And Essek sits and thinks for a second and goes, I look forward to never seeing your face again.
It's pretty clear that Essek isn't a big fan of Ludinus, and that he's not a traitor because he's allied with the Empire or the Assembly. He just wanted the research on the beacon, and implies that at this point the thing he cares most about is not hurting them, which is just really interesting. Essek is hilariously bad at keeping his cool around the Mighty Nine, which is probably just an admission of how much he cares about them in the first place, but it's just very noticeable because Ludinus goes on to comment on it.
Ludinus kind of steps forward and goes, I'm surprised to see such affection from such a previously cold individual. And Essek kind of turns his glance away and goes, well, I'm surprised myself. Maybe you should try friends sometime.
Of course, the characters are all a little unsure of how Essek is acting, but at least when I first watched this scene, and even watching it back, it revealed to me that if Essek was allied with anyone, it was likely the Mighty Nine, and not either of the countries involved in the war, or the Cerberus Assembly, who I'm treating as a separate country here, because while they're part of the government of the Empire, they largely act on their own. But for one thing, Essek seems to hate Ludinus, which is probably just because Ludinus is a bad bad person, but also because Ludinus hates the Kryn dynasty where Essek is from. It kind of reads, at least a little bit to me, like Essek, while he has his qualms with parts of the dynasty and various aspects of it, he doesn't like Ludinus's all-out disdain for the dynasty and its people. Here's the thing, I think this whole scene is very key for setting Essek up for the ultimate redemption that he received. For one thing, Ludinus notes that he was once much colder and now seems affectionate in ways he wasn't before. Another is that Matt makes it a point to show that what's bothering Essek in this scene is his turmoil over seeing his friends in this context and being forced to face the fact that he's been lying to them. Of course, the Mighty Nine is determined to confront Essek about all of this, and after entertaining some rather comical suggestions on how to do that from Jester and Veth, they decide that they shouldn't try to corner Essek at a party they're all invited to. Well, everyone but Jester and Veth agree not to confront him at the party. Both of them decide to confront him at the party anyway, mostly because he's trying to avoid them as actively as he possibly can, but Jester, frankly, is just hard to avoid when she's decided she wants to talk to you. After a long, awkward scene where Jester basically pesters him into staying despite Essek trying to run away, Veth slips a potion of paralysis into his drink, which results in Essek at first desperately trying to escape them, and then eventually he concedes to just go with them to talk. Honestly, this whole thing sounds really dramatic, but it's one of the funniest scenes in the entire campaign, partially because Caduceus had cast True Seeing on Bo, so she was basically like hearing colors, but also because after all of this starts with Essek, literally everyone walks up to Jester and Essek going, "Jester, what the fuck is happening?" And Jester has no fucking idea. And she doesn't know because Veth was the one who gave him the potion without telling her while she was invisible. Which just gets worse because Caleb seems to take this as they're trying to attack Essek, because Caleb, the person that Essek is probably closest with out of all of these people, walks up and slaps a set of manacles on him that do, I think it's like 70 damage to him all at once in an attempt to put him to sleep. It's just bad. So what I'm getting at here is that in this scene we have one person who is effectively high as a kite, another person who is just trying to figure out why Essek is suddenly paralyzed, a third is invisible and the person who paralyzed Essek, a fourth person who arguably has the closest relationship with Essek has now slapped an item on him that physically hurt him a lot. Then there's at least one person gently talking to Essek and suggesting he just give in and go with them, which he probably would have if they had just done that from the start. And two others trying to take care of the first one, who is high as a kite. Now, the point of me listing all of that out for you is just so you know that Essek had at least a little bit of a right to be a little bit salty with them once they're back on the Mighty Nine's boat. However, Essek literally already feels so bad for betraying them that he's not even a little bit upset that they basically attacked him instead of just talking to him. Here's the thing though, Essek is their fairly close friend at this point, right? They've known him for a bit, they've opened up to each other, helped each other out in a few different instances, but I feel like I should remind everyone here that Essek stole the beacon and gave it to the Cerberus Assembly several years before the events of the campaign. So the beacon heist actually happened before well, I say heist. The fandom is convinced it's a heist, that Essek performed a heist all on his own. So all of this happened before he even met and became friends with them. The most Essek is actually guilty of in regards to the Mighty Nine is not being forthright about the fact that he was the traitor all along. But the thing is, the Mighty Nine take it incredibly personally, and I would argue that they almost don't necessarily have a right to. What I mean by that is that the Mighty Nine reacts to the Essek reveal by acting as if he's done something to them personally. And while all of them have personal connections to the war, none of them were actually directly harmed by Essek. I think it's happening. I think the sunglasses are coming off. And because I can literally already hear and see the comments, I need to stop here briefly and point out that because Essek is the person who brings them to the prison where Veth's husband Yeza is being kept, a lot of people try to claim that Essek tortured Yeza. We have no proof that Essek tortured Yeza. In fact, we have no evidence that Yeza was tortured at all. The worst that Yeza says they were doing to him was not feeding him much, giving him much water, and he was just generally scared by being kidnapped, which valid. I would be too, especially if it was by people on like giant worm monsters. Anyway, that aside, you could argue that none of that would have happened to Yeza if not for the war, in which case I will point you back to the fact that while the beacons were a catalyst in ways, the war was inevitable. Like, it's kind of a stretch to say it's Essek's fault that Yeza was studying a beacon just because Essek gave the beacons to the Cerberus Assembly, especially when we know that the Empire might have found a few beacons of their own at this point. We knew for a fact before this episode that there was a beacon found on Empire land. So there's just not really a good way to blame Essek for what happens with Yeza, at least in my opinion. You can definitely differ in opinion. There's just not a lot of evidence for it. We also eventually got a description of what Essek did as Shadowhand, and most of it was intelligence-based and not, like, torture. Also, I should say right here that a lot of people try to say that Essek is a war criminal, basically because he gave the beacons to the Cerberus Assembly and therefore started a war. That's not what a war criminal is. However, I will say that Essek is a war criminal, and so is the Mighty Nine. They all together tortured and killed a prisoner of war. Also, judging this fantasy world based on how we view things like prisoners of war and war crimes and what constitutes a war crime seems a little bit silly to me. At the very least, it seems like a bad reason to come into my TikTok comments and tell me I'm a bad person for liking this character. Tell I'm a little bit salty. Now, all of this is not to downplay what Essek did, it's only to downplay what he did to the Mighty Nine. I want to be very clear that Essek made an incredibly selfish decision by handing off the beacons to the Cerberus Assembly, knowing that it might result in a conflict between the Kryn dynasty and the Empire, and that innocent lives would be lost. The thing is that is not directly harming the Mighty Nine in any way. The closest you get is Yeza. I need to discuss why Caleb actually has a pretty good case for being personally upset by everything with Essek. And also, I think he tends to handle it in the most appropriate ways. The thing is that Caleb has a lot of trust issues around the Cerberus Assembly, but particularly Trent Ickathon, who is just the worst, but was also his teacher at the Solstice Academy. Trent abused Caleb and his fellow students Astrid and Ealdwulf, culminating in the three of them being brainwashed through propaganda about the Empire, having false memories implanted in their heads of their parents being treasonous, and resulting in the three of them killing their parents, one by one, while they were all together. This is central to Caleb's character. This is central to Caleb's character throughout the entire campaign. His main goal is literally to learn enough magic that he can go back in time and save his parents from himself. Liam O'Brien explained in the campaign 2 wrap-up that Caleb took a lot of things with Essek so personally because of the fact that Caleb had previously been burned by being with Astrid and Ealdwulf. Oh, also, by the way, those three trauma bonded and were in a polyamorous relationship prior to killing their parents because Caleb is a bi-king. Just a quick note, Caleb had such a traumatic reaction to killing his parents that he wound up in the Vergessen Sanatorium, which is effectively a mental institution. He also is implied to have severely burned Astrid and became like violent afterwards. He was so not with it. I'm being as careful as I can about how I talk about this because honestly, like, I feel like Liam O'Brien did a pretty good job of representing someone who had PTSD and had gone through a very major mental health crisis in his time. He had such a severe mental break that he became violent and was potentially a risk to himself or to others, and so he wound up in the Vergessen Sanatorium. So essentially, when the party first met Essek, Caleb saw a lot of his past lovers in him since he was a fairly intelligent wizard who was amoral when it really comes down to it. Due to this comparison, Caleb took a really long time to fully trust Essek, and the reveal about Essek being the traitor actually happened shortly after Caleb had decided, okay, maybe Essek really is someone we can trust, someone that I can trust. Also, keep in mind everything I just explained about Caleb's mistrust of Essek coming from his past experiences with powerful wizards was not audience knowledge when the reveal actually happened, but he does say right after that initial reveal and when they all first find out that he feels stupid presumably simply because of these reasons. And I would say that arguably Caleb has the most appropriate response to everything that happens with Essek of the Mighty Nine. Now, I should say before I keep going that Caleb and Essek were already a fairly popular ship coined Shadowgast, a combination of Shadowhand, Essek's title, and Widowgast, Caleb's last name, but I feel like what happens next is really what solidified that ship and also solidified the fact that Essek could get a redemption arc. First, when they get on the boat and they're talking to Essek, he is very emphatically apologizing to them for giving the beacon to the Cerberus Assembly and for lying to them about being the traitor. At this point, Caleb walks up to Essek, kisses him on the forehead, don't worry, I'll explain that in a second, and then gives a speech so good I'm still in disbelief and mildly fearful of the fact that Liam O'Brien improv'd the whole thing. Like, he just came up with that off the top of his head. Amazing. So just watch this clip of Liam O'Brien doing this because I cannot do it justice. Hopefully I don't get a copyright strike over it. Again, not that my videos are monetized, I just work really hard on them and I don't want that to happen.
And I was like you. I know what a fool I have been for years. And I'm looking at him as if I am looking in a mirror. You didn't account for us. Good. That is life. Shit hits you sideways in life and no one is prepared. No one is ready. These people changed me. These people can change you. You were not born with venom in your veins. You learned it. You have a rare opportunity here, Thelyss. One chance to save yourself, and we are offering it. And I place a hand on his shoulder, pleading with you to find your better self. He is still there. I lean in and kiss him right here and say, maybe you and I are both damned, but we can choose to do something and leave it better than it was before.
Okay, so what I want to talk about here is that this speech is almost as much Caleb speaking to himself as he is speaking to Essek. I think Liam O'Brien really knew what he was doing here. He was more than aware that this speech in a lot of ways intrinsically links Caleb's ability for redemption with Essek's. If one of them can't be redeemed, then neither of them can. I think this is why Caleb kisses Essek on the forehead here, which is a callback to something that happened between Caleb and their friend Mollymock early on in the campaign. Caleb, after killing any humanoid creatures with a fire spell, would sometimes get paralyzed in some combination of fear or guilt due to his PTSD, and Mollymock was one of the first characters to reach out to Caleb in a moment like this, and, well, wake him up, but Mollymock slapped him in the face. Nothing like Mollymock, honestly. Another character I could probably write a video essay on, but I'm not going to because it would be sad. But then Molly follows slapping Caleb in the face by telling Caleb he's going to be okay and kissing him on the forehead. Caleb then does the same thing to Essek when he is in their boat wallowing in his own guilt. I think this scene was really important to giving Essek an actual chance at having a redemption arc at all. The thing is ultimately we had little to no idea whether or not Essek was being genuine during any of this. Matt plays him fairly genuinely throughout this entire scene, and frankly, this clip—
You're not going to betray us again, Essek. You're not going to, leave here and tell everyone that we know and then get us killed.
Well, that depends. You show me a kindness.
We've done nothing but show you kindness.
You're not wrong.
makes it feel like Essek really is on the Mighty Nine's side. However, all of this has shattered some trust that they had in him. Well, except for Jester, she's still convinced that he's 100% on their side and is unwavering on this belief. And frankly, I appreciate Laura Bailey's penchant for picking up a gay man as one of her character's best friends in every single campaign and believing in them with her whole heart. I also just really quickly want to mention here that some of the reasons some of the audience still was pretty distrustful of Essek after all of this was 100% because in campaign 1, because remember this is the second campaign of the Critical Role cast's public campaigns, but in campaign 1, Matt Mercer was honestly genuinely evil about betraying them with literally anyone they possibly could. There were, I think, 3 or 4 like really major, this character was secretly evil kind of reveals. So not only did the cast have this idea in their head that Matt might be messing with them, but the audience also had it in their head. So that's part of the reason that while Matt played Essek fairly genuinely throughout all of this, there were still a lot of people who were pretty skeptical of him and everything he stood for. And rightfully so, because honestly, I watched Campaign 1 in the middle of watching Campaign 2, so like, just like as I was watching Campaign 2 when I was fully caught up, I was watching episodes of Campaign 1 instead. And yeah, it explained a lot of the distrust they had for Essek in a lot of these scenes. So anyway, I will say Veth also has this very sweet speech in this where she tells Essek he's officially part of the Mighty Nine, which also makes a big difference here. She kind of implies that, yeah, he's done some bad stuff, but at this point they all have, and they're just doing their best, and so is Essek. Though the bottom line is we didn't exactly know where this was going to go. They let Essek leave because if they didn't, the meeting between the Bright Queen and King Dwendal might not happen, and the war might not end. They had no idea if Essek was just going to betray them again, or worse, throw them under the bus somehow. But all of this is to say that the Mighty Nine were really hurt regardless of whether or not they really had a reason to be taking it so personally. Except for Caleb. Caleb felt very valid, and again, he probably has the most appropriate reaction to what happens with Essek. They don't see Essek again until he appears on the Mighty Nine's boat during the meeting between the royals. When asked how he feels about everything, he says as he watches the other person that's taking the fall for him, and that he might be able to relax for the first time in months. So at this point, we know that Essek is still very much not at a place where he's fully moved past his selfish endeavors, and while nervous and guilty about hurting the Mighty Nine, is happy that he got away with it, which we'll talk about in a minute. After he leaves, the Mighty Nine actually briefly discuss that he should be punished in some way, and that maybe they are the ones who should do that. Honestly, I think this was more because Veth still holds him personally responsible for what happened with Yeza, even though, again, he didn't have a lot to do with that. And then the pandemic happened, and they didn't play for like a while as they tried to figure out how to do that as safely as possible, which was completely valid. Honestly, that was the right choice for them to make. But there was a break here, which changed some things and kind of changed the vibe of the players, in my opinion. Anyway, not unlike them not playing for a few months, the Mighty Nine just didn't talk to Essek for like a month's worth of in-game time. So let's talk about that now.
Jester, it has been a bit.
So, as I mentioned, the party doesn't talk to Essek for a good while. Part of this is just that they're distracted by the disaster that is TravelerCon, an event that Jester is helping to run for fellow worshippers of her god, the Traveler, who at this point we've discovered is actually the Archfey Artagan, who also made appearances in the first campaign and really likes dicks. He likes drawing dicks. However, after they finished with TravelerCon, the Mighty Nine return to Rexentrum, the capital of the Empire, and meet with Vestaragna, one of the members of the worst wizards in the world, the Cerberus Assembly. They're meeting her there so that they can travel with her to the ruins of Aor, far up north in what is like essentially the Arctic of the world that they're in. The world is called Exandria, by the way. I don't think I've mentioned that. Aor, just so you know, was an ancient floating city of mages that was attacked and destroyed by the gods during what's referred to as the Calamity. I'm not gonna get too much further into that, but basically the city fell and just shattered across the northern part of the world, and over centuries was buried in snow and ice. So of course, in true D&D fashion, the Mighty Nine travel all the way up there to protect Vestaragna and help her explore these ruins, but she is promptly murdered in cold blood by the reanimated body of their friend Mollymock. No, that is not a joke. Mollymock, or rather Lucian, had previously been a member of a group called the Tomb Takers, who had traveled with Ves before. While trying to complete a ritual to bring a portion of the ancient city of Aor that wound up trapped in the Astral Sea and became a Lovecraftian-style flesh monster back to the world of Exandria, Ves intentionally sabotaged the ritual in order to take the power that Lucian had at the time. After Mollymock died, Kree, who was a member of the Tomb Takers, resurrected Lucian so they could try again. I promise I'm getting to Essek, I promise. Anyway, the Mighty Nine, realizing that with Vess dead, they have to try and chase down the Tomb Takers, otherwise they're going to get blamed, and they're pretty sure that the Tomb Takers are trying to bring about the end of the world, so like, they kind of need to go stop that before they do anything else. They end up essentially racing the Tomb Takers through some of these runes to steal an artifact that they need before the Tomb Takers can get to it. This pisses Lucian off, and he essentially finds them, and there are several tense episodes where the two groups are traveling together under the pretense of Lucian will kill them if they try to leave, and also they have something that Lucian needs and he doesn't know where it is, so he can't kill them yet. Also, as an aside, he doesn't really seem to want to kill them because there's a little bit of Mollymock still in there. He's still there a little bit. Before they start to travel with Lucian, Jester actually contacts Essek to let him know that they might need his help. And to the party's surprise, Essek tells them that he's also near Aor at the Vermis outpost, which their guide explains to them is a collection of dynasty ships, which are usually just to the west of Aor. They're all a bit distrustful of Essek, well, save for Jester in this situation, since the magic involved is so powerful, and Essek has proven that he cares much more about magical research than anything else. After all, he was completely willing to let a war start if it meant he got access to some research about the beacons. Honestly, a lot of Shadowgast shippers in particular were frustrated with this because at this point a good number of people had, well, for lack of a better word, woobified Essek. If you don't know what woobified means, it's generally used to refer to characters that members of fandom really like, so they try to justify all of the bad things that they've done by making you feel bad for them. Or sometimes just justifying their actions without any reason? That's the best way I can describe it. Now, there wasn't a full-on Loki situation where they were completely ignoring a lot or all of the really bad things that Essek did, but there were a lot of people who were convinced that Essek was completely redeemed already when he hadn't really shown any sign of that yet. Like, the best we had was he said that the guy who took the fall for him was a jerk, but he was the one that Essek threw under the bus, so of course Essek would say he's a jerk. Also, this is strictly for my friend Phoenix, and this has to stay in the final cut of this video, but I really like the idea that the person that Essek threw under the bus was Essek's ex. Just throwing that out there. I've never said this on TikTok, but I do really like that idea. I think that's very funny. I also will admit, I don't really think it's true, I just think it's funny. But I do think Phoenix is gonna find this funny, so is Keys. That one's for y'all, all of my very supportive TikTok mutuals. Anyway, the Mighty Nine continued to travel under a very tenuous truce between them and the Tomb Takers, and after our Lord and Savior Ashley Johnson famously rolled an 8, resulting in the party fighting a dragon with the Tomb Takers stole what they needed to accomplish their mission and tried to leave. This resulted in an absolutely brutal fight between the two parties, which very much almost resulted in a TPK. For anyone who doesn't know, TPK stands for Total Party Kill and refers to all of the player characters in a party in a campaign dying. And yes, this TPK would have been against the Mighty Nine. Like, they almost lost. They had also fought a dragon right before this, so that's part of the reason. Anyway, after narrowly escaping with one of the things that the Tomb Takers needed to accomplish their goal, and surprisingly everyone alive, they teleport the item away and Jester insists that they go to Essek. That's not the exact order of events, but for the purposes of what I'm talking about, it's what you need to know. Mostly just Jester puts her foot down and she is like, we are going to see Essek now. Which again, thank you, Laura Bailey. You are the only reason any of this happened. Finally being away from the Tomb Takers, the Mighty Nine basically show up on Essek's doorstep after having a terrible couple of days to tell him everything that happened. You know, like that ex that you probably shouldn't be friends with anymore. Now, just a reminder, they had contacted Essek a few times throughout all of this, and at one point Caduceus, one of the two clerics in the party, cast Commune so he could communicate with his god. Now, this is really important. Caduceus worships the Wild Mother, or Melora, and she is kind of, in a lot of ways, the ultimate good goddess in this world. Like, she's a goddess of nature who is just genuinely very benevolent in the world, and most of the time you can trust her judgment. And in fact, she had recently stepped in to save Ford from his ultimate fate with his warlock patron, so he could become a paladin instead. Anyway, Caduceus communes with the Wild Mother in hopes of getting some guidance from her. The way Commune works mechanically is very important here. The caster gets to ask 3 yes or no questions to the GM, who then answers those questions by essentially playing their god. It depends on kind of which god you're working with, how that works, and obviously also depends on the GM. Like, for example, there were 2 clerics who both had access to this spell in the party, and Caduceus had a very different vibe when he cast it versus when Jester did it, so it was actually just like really interesting. Anyway, just that's an aside. One of the questions that Caduceus happened to ask while he was casting this particular commune was that if Essek is someone they can trust in this situation, which results in Matt saying this.
You see this distant star that twinkles, and when it does, you feel a sense of safety and familiarity that would confirm a yes.
Which not only results in Caduceus trusting Essek more, but also is just a generally pretty good sign that everything Essek said about being allied only with the Mighty Nine and truly being their friend was probably true. I mean, the image of a goddess of nature who is often worshipped by sailors who need to navigate via the stars, representing a person as the North Star, is incredibly significant. It was imagery that to a lot of fans meant that the Mighty Nine really could trust Essek from here on out. This is also part of the reason why, if you look at fan art of Essek, there's a lot of star imagery, and this is also the reason for the title of this section. Essek became a beacon of hope at a time when the Mighty Nine really needed that, and when they show up at his doorstep, he acts like it. Of course, the Mighty Nine were still skeptical in ways, but having both Jester and Caduceus on his side really helped. And honestly, the moment Caleb actually saw Essek in person again, he was on his side as well, almost immediately, because that man is a simp. Also, not to mention, they show up and Essek's literally just referring to them like, friends, these are my friends, telling all the guards that these are his friends. It's kind of cute, because he didn't really seem to have friends before, and now that he does have friends, he seems to want to make sure that everyone knows that they're his friends. Also, in my opinion, in these scenes, I think a lot of the reason that Essek keeps calling them friends is because he's hopeful that they are still friends. Also, admittedly, he had to tell the guards that they were his friends so that they wouldn't kill the Mighty Nine, but it's funnier to say it like this. Anyway, this whole scene is honestly very comical again. In this one 5-minute conversation, we get them giving Essek a panic attack when they explain that Vestaragna was killed. The Empire might think that the Mighty Nine did it, and then they immediately went to Essek, meaning he's now involved. Bo asking if Essek wants whiskey in his hot cocoa, and him reacting like this.
Do you want some whiskey in that cocoa?
Certainly.
And Jester implying that Caleb should show Essek the red eye he has on his back from Lucian's book, while simultaneously her and Veth are making it sound like they mean that Caleb should show Essek his dick. I love Laura Bailey so very much. But beyond the funny bits, Essek sort of explains in this scene that he took the post in Aor because he's afraid that the Cerberus Assembly might try to kill him, since he is the final person that could reveal their connection to the beacons being stolen, which in this moment hadn't been revealed to King Dwendal or the Bright Queen, so Essek is a loose thread in that situation. This scene is also really interesting because for the first time we're not seeing any selfish motivations from Essek, it's more like actual cowardice. He basically just ran away in hopes of not being killed too quickly, and even says that he's aware that he's on borrowed time, and Essek seems like he wants to make amends for what he did, at least to the Mighty Nine. He's also very clear that he'll help the Mighty Nine with whatever they need because he can tell that things are fairly dire. Honestly, this is also key to Essek's redemption, in my opinion, the fact that he was so willing to put his life on the line once his friends were coming to him and telling him that the world might end. Essek isn't being selfish at this point beyond trying to keep himself alive, and he desperately wants to help his friends. He's incredibly ashamed of the things that he did, to the point where he's having a hard time making eye contact with them. Notably, he can't make eye contact with Caleb at all. And again, they hadn't seen him or talked to him in a little over a month, meaning he got to this point almost entirely on his own, and he keeps emphasizing the way that the consequences of his actions are catching up to him without blaming anyone else for it. And he actually says this.
When you gave me trust, it gave me a perspective that was so agonizingly striking. So easy to see that I refused to acknowledge it at first. I would be lying if I said that our paths crossing hasn't shaken me to the core.
Like, he literally tells them outright that his perspective has changed, and in response, Caleb offers him the possibility of regaining their trust. Essek takes full responsibility for what he did, and even seems to take responsibility for being mildly rude in this scene. Not that he hasn't taken responsibility for being rude before, I don't know why I said it like that. This is why, at least in my opinion, as they're all leaving, Caleb stops Essek and basically reassures him that they're still friends, it'll just take time to rebuild that trust. Which is probably the actual reason Caleb softens to Essek so much in the final arc, arc, but honestly, on first watch, it came off like Caleb didn't trust Essek and then completely forgot about all of that as soon as he was back in the same room with him, as if Caleb had a mind of his own and Liam O'Brien had zero control over it. I say that mostly because in the after show for Campaign 2, Talks Machina, Liam actually called Essek toxic to the situation and said that he didn't think they should go to him for help, which is why it's just especially funny that it seemed like Caleb did a total 180 after seeing Essek again. But Essek also explains that the Dynasty might also be onto him as someone who was working with the Empire from within the court of the Bright Queen. However, there is one last thing in this scene that I want to talk about, which is the fact that we find out that Essek's main contact with the Cerberus Assembly was Ludinus Deleth, who I mentioned before. He was the one that met with Essek in the boat. The reason I want to call this out is because a lot of people have made the connection that much like Trent took advantage of a young Caleb, it's interesting to note that Ludinus arguably did the same thing with Essek. Ludinus is a significantly older elven man, and I'm not sure if I've mentioned this yet, but Essek is only a bit into his 2nd century. This implies that he's the elf equivalent of like a 23 to 25-year-old. So imagine a 50-year-old man and a 23-year-old. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it largely speaks to the fact that while Essek made the decisions he did on his own as an adult, he also did it at the influence of someone much older than him who probably knew that Essek was the only one who would ever see consequences from the situation. You see, it's unlikely that the Dynasty would go after Ludinus if they found out that he was one of the people involved due to diplomatic reasons. It could ignite another war, and it's also unlikely that the Empire would bring him to justice for it, so long as Ludinus never provided Essek with the research or knowledge they'd gained from studying the beacons. All Ludinus ever did was steal Dynasty secrets by working with Essek. His actions benefited the Empire's interests against the Dynasty, and here's the most important part. We know for a fact by the time of the reveal that Essek had not received any of the research on the Luxon beacons that the Cerberus Assembly had conducted. This is supported by the fact that Yeza has to explain what Vesteragna was having him do with the beacons to Essek, and while this might have been a lack of an insight check in that situation, Essek genuinely doesn't seem to have known about Yeza's research at all, and we never get confirmation that Ludinus provided Essek with any research after the reveal. We only get confirmation that the Cerberus Assembly is trying to kill Essek to tie up loose ends. Even in the finale, when Essek is leaving after Caleb hugs Essek and tells him not to be a stranger, he also tells Essek to be kind to himself, and Essek says this:
"You more than anyone show me that trauma doesn't define you."
Which really just caught my attention because to an extent, I think Essek means some of what he went through once he was with the Mighty Nine was trauma, but he also can't not mean what happened to him before all of this, meaning that Essek views the beacon exchange as some form of trauma in some way. So it's actually kind of likely that Ludinus straight up lied to and manipulated Essek and then never followed through with his end of the bargain. And while some of this is conjecture, it rings very similar to Trent lying to Caleb about his parents being treasonous. I could be off on this, but I do think it's significant to Essek's character. Essek doesn't imply that he was necessarily manipulated in any way, but when you think about the implications of the situation, it's highly likely that Ludinus worked with Essek for a reason, especially when you consider the fact that Essek is a narrative foil almost one-to-one to Caleb, from being a wizard to having only one close friend at the start who is a goblin. I think there's definitely something to the interpretation that Essek might have been manipulated in some way into being involved in the beacon plot. Now, short of there being magic involved, I don't think this forgives any of Essek's actions, but I think it's definitely in line with one of the parts of having a good redemption arc. Essek is both realizing that his actions were wrong, while the audience is gathering that there was a lot more to this than Essek just being selfish. At least in my opinion, it gives us a lot of context about Essek's situation, knowing that Ludinus was his main contact with the Cerberus Assembly. Either way, this entire scene stresses Essek out so much that he asks the Mighty Nine to leave for a bit so that they would not be bringing danger upon each other, something that's actually a fairly realistic concern. He also clarifies that he's genuinely happy to see them, and that he's just very much concerned for all of their safety. Anyway, this is where things get weird. Things get weird and very tied to Caleb's backstory. So, during this whole Aor arc, the Mighty Nine briefly goes to the Vergessen Sanatorium, where Caleb was for several years, to steal some stuff from Trent Ickathon, who is the worst person in the world and deserves it. He was also Caleb's old teacher. Honestly, they probably could have just asked Trent, but Trent is creepy, and I don't blame them for just deciding to steal it instead. A lot of people got really harsh on them about this decision, but really, I get it. He was creepy. Everything that happens as a result just really drives home what a disgusting abuser Trent is, because he literally tries to hunt down their families due to them breaking in and stealing some magical necklaces that hide them from being watched via magic. They were stealing them so that Lucian couldn't watch them, but I'm bringing this whole thing up because it's wrapped up in Caleb's arc, and I think it's notable to Caleb and Essek's relationship. Caleb has a lot of trauma around teachers, and because of this, he very intentionally doesn't use anything that Trent taught him, or could take credit for Caleb knowing during the break-in scene. This results in Caleb killing several guards with some dunamancy spells that he reverse engineered based on the principles that Essek taught him earlier in the campaign. Trent, being the creepy creep that he is, immediately starts to threaten Essek to Caleb, and he does so by speaking directly into Caleb's brain with the sending spell. So basically, they put Essek in an incredibly dangerous situation because they wanted to steal some artifacts. Sounds familiar. Trent also calls Caleb in these messages by what is effectively his dead name, which he does in just like the worst way possible. Also, just you need to hear at least one of these to understand what I mean by how creepy Trent is.
It was dangerous to go in there.
Beth's voice, as she's talking to you, almost seems to echo and fade as a voice fills your mind.
Oh.
Now, Bren, that was uncalled for. Conversation. See, now I'm worried. About this time, a familiar voice creeps back into your mind.
This guy.
Traces of dunamancy left in this wake. I have my theories on where you might have learned this.
Anyway, after saying goodbye to literally everyone they know as if they might not survive this encounter, they go back to meet with Essek, and they briefly float the idea of working with Trent, even though he's the absolute worst, to Essek. More specifically, Liam O'Brien was trying to get every single one of Caleb's romantic interests into a single location, and as he describes it,
I could have been caught in the middle of a bisexual maelstrom.
So my point here is... Okay, I swear I have a point to this section. No, really, I have a point to this section, I promise. It's that the Mighty Nine put Essek in even more danger by stealing from Trent, and specifically, I think Caleb felt particularly guilty about this since he was the one who revealed their connection to Essek to Trent. They all genuinely feel bad about this, and after Jester warns him about it, Essek basically says that if they don't come to meet him soon, he might just disappear on them. After they arrive is particularly when Caleb tries to convince Essek that they should work with Trent, but Liam O'Brien rolls a nat 1. So that doesn't work. This is promptly followed by Caduceus asking Essek to take his shirt off, which is just funny because he basically takes no convincing to do that, even though it seems to be something that he fundamentally does not like. It's just a little bit funny. Anyway, the scene is also interesting just because Essek is, again, genuinely very worried over all of their safety, but also is like, what the hell happened while you were gone? Because keep in mind, they were only gone for like a day and a half. Like, it was not very long, which is when they explain what they did and why Trent is so mad at them and why Trent has then also threatened Essek. However, one thing I find particularly interesting is Essek saying in this moment that his presence at the outpost puts everyone in danger. Not just him, not just the Mighty Nine, but all of the people who are working there under him. Because as I mentioned, Essek is in charge of the outpost. He's not just like there hiding, he literally runs it. I think I mentioned that before. This also wasn't the first time he mentioned being responsible for the people there, but this moment in particular, it's clear he is thinking about the people around him. He's concerned not just that someone like Trent will come and kill him, he's also concerned that they'll potentially hurt the people at the outpost trying to get him. Also, I just want to say the fandom during this whole thing was convinced that the Mighty Nine was going to show up and that Essek was already going to be dead, so the fact that he was alive was already kind of a win. Anyway, It's a significant change to how we've seen Essek before. Prior to this, we know that while he worked in some form of political space, that he primarily worked alone. I think this mention of his personal responsibility to protect the people around him is one of the first divergences we've seen in his character, besides him caring very deeply for the Mighty Nine. Another note to make here is that when discussing the idea of forming an alliance with Trent, Essek actually parrots almost exactly the anxiety that Bo and Caleb had about Essek about Trent. Like, he literally says that Trent might just take Lucian's magic for himself rather than helping them, which was almost exactly what Bo and Caleb said about Essek. Keep in mind, Bo and Caleb had read Lucian's book and both had several red eyes on them that they couldn't get rid of. It was not lost on the audience that all of this was a bit ironic in ways. Truly, they did not take the precautions necessary, and Essek was already thinking ahead of them. Oh, and as an aside, Caleb also suggests they invite Trent and then kill him somewhere in Aor in this scene, which, like, Trent markedly would have deserved. When Essek ultimately does refuse to work with Trent, one thing I find very intriguing about it is actually that he thinks him being there will just make things messier than they need to be. Like, he's afraid of what Trent might do to him, but he is also very much concerned that his presence with Trent there will just prevent the Mighty Nine from reaching their goal. He doesn't really provide a reason for this, but it's kind of interesting that even then, his major concern isn't really even his life so much as making sure that he won't be antithetical to the Mighty Nine's mission. But after Essek refuses to work with Trent, which, like, valid, he offers to follow them even if they do decide to work with Trent anyway, so that he can be there to help regardless. Also, he has this supercut 2 hours and 30 minutes reaction to Caleb showing him the eye on his shoulder, which is just kind of funny. Essek then gives him a moment alone to make a decision, and the party takes barely even 5 seconds to decide that they're working with Essek and not Trent, because truly, that was the better choice. And thank God, because I think Essek's stan Twitter might have imploded if they had chosen to work with Trent instead of Essek. And it would have been mildly comical, but also I would have been very upset personally with everyone else on Essek's stan Twitter, because that's the side of Twitter I'm mostly on. Anyway, this is also one of the first times we ever see Essek get described as essentially going soft. Caleb tells him that they trust him, and Essek is, like, really happy about it. He also says that he hopes he can make things up to them. Then he gets embarrassed and changes the subject, which, like, same, Essek, there's a reason I identify with this character so much. Anyway, time for part 6.
Yes, Essek, we are going to stick with you.
Okay, so all of that was just to set up for Essek's redemption, and God, this is going to be so hilariously long. Sorry for the 2-hour video, I guess. I'm gonna apologize, an hour and something. There was a lot in this final arc, and a lot that was a big part of Essek's redemption, so I might not touch on everything, but I'm going to do my best to cover as much as possible. The thing I want to start with here is that one of the first things Essek does is use an illusion to make their clothes look white to better blend into the snow, because apparently he's the only one to think of that. In fact, besides Jester, he's the only one that's been wearing white up until this point. There's still purple on him, but he's also wearing white. He then completely fails like 3 times to dispel some form of tracking curse marker thing on Ford's chest, only to have Jester successfully get it off in one shot. Now here's the thing, up until this point, Essek had really been an NPC in a lot of ways, but with him traveling alongside the party, Essek became a DM PC. Why am I harping on this? Entirely because it means that Essek got Matt Mercer's apparently god-awful dice luck when he's playing a character rather than GMing. Trust me, if you watch Exandria Unlimited, you will understand what I mean. Essek definitely got this. Anyway, the point is that whenever Matt rolled for Essek, he tended to roll terribly, which is honestly comical more than anything because Essek is supposed to be this super cool wizard guy, and it made him seem like a total nerd. Actually, a lot of things that happened in this final arc made Essek come across just so genuinely sweet. It was kind of weird, because in case you don't remember, one of the first things he says to the Mighty Nine is,
"Do we have to kill you to get him out of here?"
I'd like to see you try.
I think the Mighty Nine could have taken him at level 5. There's a few moments prior to them engaging with the Tomb Takers where Essek is just goofing around with the party that are pretty telling that they've kind of absorbed him into the group. Most importantly, this is the point at which Caleb and Essek's arcs sort of grow together officially. For starters, Caleb is kind of the one who reassures Essek that he'll be fine once they start fighting. Also, this is where we find out that Essek is a bit of a librarian and hasn't really fought anyone before, which truly is just peak comedy when you remember that Essek is literally feared in the Dynasty. Like, I'm gonna bring up his Explorer's Guide to Wildmount description. Like, Explore the darker elements of Dunamancy, my ass. Essek, you're a gigantic nerd. I mean, I guess we do see him pretty brutally kill someone at some point, but that was like in a confined space where they couldn't fight back. At least in the context of the show, it's pretty clear that some of Essek's public persona is fake. This is also one of the only moments that Caleb and Essek get to spend some time alone, which was great because we got to hear Essek and Caleb talk about their very similar but also very different pasts. This happens as Caleb is showing Essek around the tower, which was Caleb's version of the spell Mordekainen's Magnificent Mansion, which allows a player to create a pocket dimension that looks like whatever they want, basically. Most people go with just a big old mansion, but Caleb had like a whole wizard tower. Anyway, Caleb is showing Essek around because this is the first time Essek has seen the tower, and it's kind of a remarkable feat, honestly. It's a big show of how Caleb has grown as a wizard and a person in a lot of ways. Caleb's entire tower is basically a love letter to his friends, and the very top floor mimics the experience of staring into a Luxon beacon to gain what's called a mote of possibility mechanically. This just represents being able to re-roll a single die roll, but in the show it's like really cool magic, but to do it they stare into the beacon for like a long period of time and focus on it. To me, the room very much represents all the ways that Caleb's lives could have gone, and I think that's why it's included. But what's also interesting here is that it also feels very tied to Essek. This scene where Caleb and Essek are on the top floor of Caleb's tower in a room which represents Caleb's first contacts with Dunamancy, but also the many roads his life could have gone down, it's hard to deny that it's significant. It's also the start of Essek kind of reversing their roles a little bit.
Because if you were to put the very thing that I have wondered about for so many years in front of me, I'm really not sure what my reaction would be.
You're still very young.
You've been around a while longer.
A bit. I know what pursuits of the mysteries of magic can bring, good and bad. The fact that you can acknowledge this path gives me hope, but...
The one thing that has stayed true, though, is that I carry a lot of sins. Like you do.
Not anywhere like I do.
Don't be so sure.
Kind of looks down to catch your attention. I'm pretty sure, young man.
Essek here is doing for Caleb almost exactly what Caleb did for him on the boat. Both of them have an incredible amount of guilt for their respective mistakes, and like I said before, Caleb directly tied their redemption together. Essek is now doing the same, even as Caleb tries to tell Essek that Caleb is not as good as he seems. There are two more things I want to point out in this scene. One, Essek has no idea what Caleb did, and he doesn't even seem to care, nor does he ever try to ask. I think a big reason for this is honestly because to him, it doesn't really matter. Nothing that Caleb has done is any worse or any better than what Essek has. I think the fact that Essek sees it this way is really interesting, since it feels a bit like he's at the very least accepting that for Caleb, which means he's probably on the road to accepting it for himself. He also makes a point to call Caleb by his full name, which is something that I find interesting for a few reasons, but especially because Essek fully knows that Caleb has another name, but he's one of the few characters that doesn't ask if Caleb wants them to call him by his old name. I don't know what it is, but Essek seems to intuitively gather that Caleb wants to be Caleb and not Bren. And Essek seems to go out of his way to affirm Caleb's identity to him.
Come with me, Shadowgast. Isn't that right, Caleb? Caleb Shadowgast. Caleb Shadowgast.
I don't know if this just read as significant to me because I'm non-binary and I have a lot of trans friends, but adding it to Essek's character made him not sympathetic, but admirable in a way that was really important. I think this scene is honestly indicative of the ways in which both Caleb and Essek have changed, but it also very much sets up for what's to come through the final episodes of the campaign. Not only does Essek reassure Caleb that Caleb is a better person than Caleb thinks, they also agree to look out for each other and basically keep each other in check. So all of this happens pretty much as they're waiting for the Tomb Takers to show up because they've set a trap for the group. Honestly, this plan works like crazy well. Like, they kill most of the Tomb Takers here, and the only ones who survive are Lucian and Kree. They also manage to escape, which sucks, but as a quick side note, I don't want to cover this too much, but this does come at the expense of some of Essek's soldiers. Thankfully not at the expense of their wonderful guide, who I loved because he sounded a lot like Cole Cassidy from Overwatch, who Matt Mercer also plays. And while I could dwell on this, Essek isn't the one who makes the decision to put these soldiers in harm's way. It's actually Ford who does it. And there's also a big difference between soldiers being injured or killed and like innocent people being killed. So I'm just not going to cover this part much, and I wanted to explain why. However, because Lucian and Kree get away, this means that they now need to chase Lucian and Kree through the ruins of of Aor to stop them from bringing the Eldritch flesh monster to the world. Honestly, I am so glad that this happened. Mostly, I'm really glad that this happened because I'm personally super into world building, and so delving into the ancient ruins of this ancient city of mages was like really up my alley. Like, it was a great tone setter for me for the end of the campaign. Anyway, it also came with a lot of surprising moments where Essek really acts as Caleb's voice of reason, which I just really liked, and cut to me crying over this ship while listening to I Found by Amber Run. I have a note that says film that, it'll be funny in here. So to give you some context, Aor is kind of like a minefield for both Essek and Caleb. It's an ancient city from the Age of Arcanum, meaning the period of time where mages basically ruled the world. There are things down there that both of them desperately want to know more about, but as they move through the runes, Caleb is actually the one who gets distracted far easier than Essek. Essek has a little bit more experience kind of resisting this sort of temptation. Also, he's an elf, which generally just temperament-wise, they have a lot more time on this planet, so they can wait a little bit. At one point, while Caleb is sealing a bunch of books into his amber vaults, that sounds like a euphemism, oh my god, okay. At one point, while Caleb is sealing a bunch of books into his amber vaults, I really wish I had phrased that sentence better, basically, Caleb is putting like a bunch of books into a piece of amber so that he can carry them more easily. Like, it makes it into like a necklace. And anyway, Essek hangs back with him while he does this to basically just kind of check on him. Fun aside, Yasha is also there, but we found out way later it was because it was Yasha's job to kill Caleb if he got mind controlled by Lucian. So she was really there to make sure that she didn't need to drive a sword into Caleb's chest, which is just kind of interesting. All of that aside, Essek stays behind, and surprisingly, he stays behind not to help Caleb, but to remind him that they're there with a specific goal in mind. Like, I really thought he was going to help Caleb get some of these books into the amber and maybe pick a few out that he wanted to read, but instead, Essek started literally doing the exact opposite of what Caleb and Bo thought he would do. Instead of trying to hoard more knowledge, he's reminding Caleb that he needs to move on and that they shouldn't be spending 10 minutes trying to seal these books. In fact, more importantly, he's acting exactly how he said he would in Caleb's tower. He's reminding Caleb that he shouldn't grasp at power when they have a mission on their hands already. He does say that they can come back and look at all of this later, but it's at least not trying to get as much knowledge as possible right now. There's another similar moment where they find some little miniature beacons. Actually, hold on, quick pause. Hello. I made this specifically to be a prop for this video, right? And the lights that I bought to go in the bottom of this to light it up, because it would look really cool lit up, and especially since these are more purple than they are gray, lighting it up yellow would make them look a little bit more gray, right? So here's the thing. I made this prop for this video that I was going to use somewhere in it, and the light went out the day after I put it together. And the light is down here. Anyway, I just wanted to get this out because this was like the mini beacon prop that I was supposed to be holding in this section, or not holding, but like have out so you guys could see it. So there's actually another very similar moment where they find some little miniature Luxon beacons, because keep in mind an actual Luxon beacon, this is like the size of my palm because, you know, crystal is expensive, but a Luxon beacon is actually like this big. But they find these little miniature Luxon beacons, and when they do, Essek is super interested in what they are and what they do, much like Caleb was earlier on with the books. There's actually this very funny moment where Essek grabs Caleb's head to like drag him closer to see the little Luxon beacon, which like, sure, okay. Anyway, the mini Luxon beacons are actually in these big machines, and once they get them out, Essek almost immediately hands them over to Caleb. Like, Essek, before he even gets too caught up, hands something that would be huge to his research over to Caleb like it's basically nothing. Well, not really nothing, but when you contrast it with Essek risks starting a war because he wanted to get research on the beacons Thelyss, kind of significant. Up until this point, there had been moments showing that Essek's way of thinking had changed, but this is the most clear representation of that change. He's no longer trying to hoard the beacon or learn as much about it as possible at the risk of other people, and is instead putting those people ahead of his own research. He's actively putting what they're doing ahead of his own pursuits. I think this stuck with Caleb, honestly, because the next time he's presented with a temptation, he also backs down on it, knowing that their pursuit of Lucian is more important. I really want to focus on this scene for a bit because I really need to emphasize what a temptation this was for Caleb. So I mentioned previously that Caleb's end goal up until this point was to get enough magical power to go back in time to save his parents from his younger self. Again, we didn't know the exact specifics of his plan yet, but we did know it probably involved time travel. He also at one point when Bo asked him what he wanted to do, Caleb said he wanted to bend reality to his will in this really intense way, which very much to a lot of people read as like, especially with like further clues that he wanted to be able to time travel. Which means that this teledoc meant to send someone back in time was a significant temptation for Caleb. To use it also requires a great deal of knowledge in both transmutation, Caleb's specialty, and dunamancy, which is Essek's specialty, meaning they feasibly could have dropped everything and made it work in that exact moment. But Caleb doesn't do that. He walks away from it the same way that Essek handed over the mini beacons to him. They basically end up consistently mirroring each other through these scenes, keeping each other in check or looking to each other as a gauge. There's also Jester's with them in this scene, and while it's emotionally charged for Caleb, this moment is also a lot of Caleb and Essek just flirting with each other, to the point where Jester asks Caleb outright if Essek is flirting with him, and Caleb just says, "It's complicated." Telepathically, so that only Jester hears it. The telepathy is something that's coming from one of the eyes on him, but also that must have been entirely awkward for Essek when you think about it. Like, Essek heard Jester ask, and then Caleb just looked at her and didn't give her an answer. Anyway, moving on. Now, they're racing against time, and something they've already established about the mini beacons is that they can be used to manipulate time. In fact, the machines that the mini beacons were in reversed time on Ford by a day, restoring his hair after it all fell out due to a wild magic effect that exists in Aeor. Which, like, this thumbnail, this Critical Role thumbnail is still that everyone edited to make Travis bald is really funny. Anyway, they come to a crossroad where the group needs to pursue Lucian, but they also desperately need to rest. Honestly, this whole final arc just really drove home what a resource management game Dungeons & Dragons is. Hardy was completely exhausted nearly every step of this whole process, and it's a big part of the reason that Lucian and Kree got away in the first place. Seeing this, Essek actually steps up and suggests they use one of the mini beacons they found to cast a spell that will potentially help them recover. So he has Caleb sit down with him, and Essek actually sacrifices one of the mini beacons to give the party a long rest. Poof. Gone. Now, Essek actually manages to do this basically because this is the only time that Matt actually rolled well for Essek, because the only way this actually worked was because Essek rolled a nat 20 for it. Because I think Caleb rolled like a 14 or a 15 and they needed like over 40 or something collectively. And this is also part of the reason I find it frustrating when people say that Essek didn't do anything useful. It's not his fault that Matt Mercer has terrible dice luck and literally the party would have probably died without him. Though granted in this scene he could have also sent them a day forward, giving Lucian and Kree plenty of time to bring the Flesh City back to the world and they wouldn't have gotten any reward out of it. But that didn't happen, so it doesn't matter. And in fact, Essek was unsure if that would be the result if he failed. But my point is that Essek goes above and beyond not only to act as a voice of reason to Caleb, but also just to literally help his friends. He's willing to sacrifice his research, something he was once willing to start a war to get, to save a world he used to not really care about. And it doesn't really read as selfish either. He does it almost entirely out of genuinely wanting to help his friends. Okay, and maybe a bit of him wanting to just do the cool magic thing, but this is definitely not the darker side of dunamancy. Essek has clearly hit a point where he's not thinking of selfish pursuits, he's instead focusing on using dunamancy as something that can help the people around him, which again is a significant shift from how he was before, and definitely a shift from how he's described in the Explorer's Guide to Wildmount.
Let's finish this. Press my forehead to his forehead, and then turn back towards all the shit that's happening around us.
All right.
Okay, so like I said, a lot of stuff happens in Aeor, so I'm going to skip over everything but this scene where Caduceus picks Essek up.
So as you lift, Essek's like, ah!
Thus confirming that Essek floats everywhere he goes, but absolutely hates being carried. I'm kidding, but I am going to skip over most of the Flesh City and directly into the final battle against Lucian. There's just a lot of good moments in the final battle of all of them working together in a way that really suits what I'm talking about, so that's what I'm going to focus on. There's a lot of people getting mind controlled and buildings are kind of getting thrown around and at them, but there's also this very nice scene where after Essek drags Caleb out from under a chunk of building that Lucian threw at him, saying that Caleb's friends need Caleb.
Essek steps forward while still slowed, just goes, Caleb, they need you. and takes your arm and is going to try and pull you out.
Oh, buddy.
After Essek sacrifices a turn to pull Caleb out from under a chunk of building, Caleb presses their foreheads together. I'll play the clip.
Let's finish this.
Press my forehead to his forehead, and then turn back towards all the shit that's happening around.
Honestly, I wanted to call this out because it's significant to their relationship and it's really cute, but also because it's the first time that Essek receives any sort of like physical comfort outside of Jester hugging him, more as a practical joke than anything. Like, Jester genuinely wanted to hug him, but this was early on in knowing Essek, and she definitely said she held on to him just a bit too long to essentially unnerve him. Okay, no. Actually, so you could count Caleb kissing him on the forehead in the boat as one too, but there's just very little, and 2 out of 3 times it comes from Caleb. More significantly, I wanted to point out that Essek reacts very positively to this, like openly positively, and then Caleb dies saving Jester from Luke, and we don't see any sort of reaction from Essek. Now, I just want to clarify that the reason we don't see a response from Essek in any capacity in this moment is because Matt was far too distracted with everything else going on in the fight to really have Essek have a reaction. Unfortunately, a lot of stuff like this goes by the wayside because Essek is being played by the GM, and as someone who also tends to play a lot of GM or DM PCs, I totally understand how this happens. And yes, I am forever going to be salty about it, but I'm not mad at Matt Mercer for it. Anyway, they resurrect Caleb and he's fine. He's pretty injured, but he's alive, so that's good. Caleb then grabs his transmuter stone and places it on Lucian's chest because he is fully prepared to try and resurrect Mollymauk. Essek is actually the only one who questions him for a moment. Honestly, my guess is that it's partially because he's fearful they'll get Lucian instead, but honestly, the way he directs the question at Caleb and Caleb's reaction, it's almost as if Essek is asking Caleb if he's going to be able to handle the ramifications of the spell not working. Okay, I'll admit that's more my interpretation than anything, but that's the point of a video essay, for me to share my many opinions on this character that has consumed all of my brain power since he was introduced. I mean, just like, look at him. Just look at him. Just look. So anyway, Caleb tries to resurrect Molly and it fails. Like, it just completely fails. Matt rolls the final die and he rolls a 2 and it just doesn't work, and Ashley Johnson broke my heart because her character Yasha was closest with Mollymauk and she wasn't even there when he died because she had been kidnapped and he died trying to save her. So when she says this...
There's nothing else to do. Caleb.
There's just no living, honestly. There is only pain. All angst, no pain. No pain, no gain. Back to Essek though really quick, because Essek's reaction to all of this is probably the most emotion we've seen him show outside of the guilt from when he told them about being the one who stole beacons. Here's the thing, in this scene, Essek cries, and I want to make it very clear, Essek never knew Mollymauk. Essek isn't crying because his friend didn't come back to life. He's crying for his friends. After he walks away, Ford actually has to approach him, and Essek ends up saying this.
It's not fair. We've all come so far. It's just not fair.
This is, again, the most emotion we've seen out of Essek. There was the boat where he was clearly very ashamed, and then there was that time he got very frustrated with them, but even then he wasn't very emotive. The fact that he's crying is pretty significant. I think this was a very intentional choice on Matt's part. Essek as a character was cold, not because he was necessarily entirely selfish or cruel, but because he hadn't been surrounded by people who evoked that feeling in him. And the Mighty Nein seemed to do that, and that's what the distinct change is here. Overall, from the scenes you get with Essek, you don't particularly get the feeling that he matches the description from the book. It's interesting because I feel like not only did the Mighty Nein change Essek in a lot of ways, they didn't do it by making him a different person. They did it by bringing out the best in Essek. Rewatching this scene is really what made me realize that Essek's redemption arc isn't really about him making up for what he did, at least not entirely. There's an element of that there. To me, his redemption is all about forgiving himself for what he did at his worst so that he can become his best self. I think this is true of Caleb as well, and both of their arcs are about moving past the sort of guilt and unwillingness to love yourself that comes with making big mistakes with dire consequences. In fiction, it's easy to accidentally forget what a character did just because they've become a better character by the end of the story. And I think what both Matt Mercer and Liam O'Brien did here was force everyone who liked both Caleb and Essek to never forget the bad things that they did. I think by forcing you to look at the whole picture, to never forget where Essek and Caleb came from, made their redemption more powerful narrative. Instead of just magically being a better person now, we see them work through their guilt and shame, but not forget it. I think it honestly does a disservice to any redemption arc when the character seems to have forgotten everything that they did. If they get to ignore it and pretend like it didn't happen, or that it was some old self that did it, to me, they didn't really learn and grow, they just kind of changed. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but I certainly hope that it does. Anyway, this whole scene is pretty heartbreaking, and Essek breaking down crying here is definitely a sign of his redemption being fairly genuine. It's a moment where we get to see his growth in a very obvious way, and I think it's important to his overall story. But the party all sort of gather around their dead friend's body for the second time and try to console each other as best they can. However, Caduceus stays pretty level-headed. For one thing, he never knew Mollymauk, and also, he generally was pretty level-headed all the time. And also, he's level-headed because he walks away to cast Divine Intervention while no one's paying attention. Divine Intervention mechanically allows a player to essentially ask for like one thing for their god to do, and their god can kind of just give it to them. Like, their god can just decide, you know what? As a treat, and it works, which is honestly kind of crazy because there was a 15% chance that that would work, but it worked. So Caduceus manages to bring Mollymauk back to life. There's honestly another video essay here about what happened with Mollymauk, and I can't address it here because honestly this essay is so long in the first place. Point is that Mollymauk, to their knowledge, comes back to life. But to finish off talking about this scene, Essek is elated for his friends. Honestly, they have a bunch of like nice debrief conversations where they talk about how good the different characters are or how much better they're getting. Like, at one point in the scene, Caduceus just compliments Essek a bunch because he can tell that Essek is going in the right direction. Another sign that Essek is going through a redemption arc. Because there is still some people who don't think he was redeemed. And I want to emphasize that Caduceus is right. Essek is going in the right direction. Even after all of this, it's pretty clear that Essek still has a lot of work to do, both in forgiving himself and making up for what he did, which is just another part of his story that I think makes it so well done. Essek is growing and becoming a better person, but that doesn't mean he couldn't fall right back into how he used to be. Honestly, if the Mighty Nine betrayed him in some way, Essek would probably have a villain arc. Not that he wasn't a villain to start with, but like, just a quick pause. Essek was supposed to be a minor antagonist for the Mighty Nine, and instead they adopted him into the group, so they Grinched him, as Matt put it. Grinched the fuck out of that guy. While it's not likely that Essek will fall back into his bad habits because he has his friends around him, I think the reminder that it could happen is very realistic and calls back to what I said earlier about not ignoring what Essek did.
I am so greatly thankful.
Okay. So before I get too into this, I have to clarify that I'm focusing on what's in the text of the show, the Campaign 2 wrap-up, and a couple of the tweets that Matt and Liam put out afterwards. I am clarifying this because I am operating under the pretense that Caleb and Essek have a romantic relationship after the events of the campaign, which at some point turns into a close friendship because Liam O'Brien really likes angst and really couldn't ignore the differences in Caleb and Essek's lifespans. It's fine. I'm fine. Anyway, the point is that some of this wound up kind of muddy. I'm going to give the cast of Critical Role the benefit of the doubt and assume that while this all fell a bit flat in ways, which I will get to in a minute, they went into it with good intentions, and their impact was not harmful enough to really tear them apart over it. Also, while he has been a bit cagey about labeling himself specifically, we pretty well know that Liam is part of the LGBT community, and that he's not just an ally based on things he said in both Critical Role stuff and on Twitter. And just as a general rule, I do tend to give members of the LGBT community a little bit more leeway in these situations because they could be trying to represent their lived experience, which I am not privy to, but is perfectly valid. And I made several TikToks about this, but the thing is, due to the nature of all of this being improv, I do truly think that Matt and Liam thought that they were being clear in the moment that Caleb and Essek were in a romantic relationship, especially considering how they both had to basically be told that some people found it unclear. So I just wanted to make it clear that I'm not going to in depth discuss the confusion and valid concerns people had about this topic, mostly because I've already done it on TikTok and I think I've already said my opinions very clearly. honestly. Anyway, I'll gather all of my TikToks and like put them into a playlist for you as like, I don't know, further reading for this already 2-hour long video. That way, if you're interested in what happened, you can get a better idea of what was going on. Okay. All of that out of the way, let's talk about Caleb's past catching up to him. I mentioned earlier that they stole things from Trent, and up until this point, they had used those items to keep cover from both Trent and Lucian. As they readied themselves for battle with Lucian, several of them took said items off, thus revealing their location to Trent, and basically as soon as they teleported back to the Prime Material Plane, Trent was on their tail. Also, the Prime Material Plane is just like not the Astral Sea, for those of you who don't know much about D&D. So in like the weirdest Thunderdome ever, they end up fighting both Trent and Caleb's former lovers in the final episode. And in my humble opinion, this was a mistake, but I understand that they have a filming schedule and going another episode might have just been like too much and might have really messed up their schedule. That being said, this episode was like 7.5 hours long and the epilogues felt very rushed for that reason. Like when they announced that the campaign was ending, I was never one of those people who was upset that they weren't going to tie up all of the loose ends, or beyond my like initial like, oh, that kind of sucks, that's sad. I truly felt like it made sense. And I really just wish they'd given themselves more space to do this. If it had been 2 full episodes instead of 1, I think it would have helped a lot. The thing is combat in D&D takes a long time, and while there were some good moments in this particular fight, it consumed the first half in such a way that I think it distracted them from the overall story they were telling. But before I get too into the details of the epilogues, I want to talk about the fight and some of the things that happened immediately afterwards. For one thing, they kind of like obliterate Trent. Like when it comes down to it, while Trent was powerful, all of them together, especially after Astrid and Aeolwulf betray him, he just really stood no chance. He is also the stupidest man alive.
I think it has been a long time since anyone has pointed out to you that you were a fool.
Okay, so I was actually talking to some friends about this, and it reminded me, and I want to put it here. So there's a very important scene with Trent where Caduceus informs him that he is the stupidest man alive. The thing is that Trent showed up with just Astrid and Aeolwulf, so 2 support people, to fight a party of like 7+ people. Like, he was pretty sure there were at least 7 of them. Now, I do have some theories why this went down the way it did. I think Trent might come back up somewhere, somehow. I don't know how that's going to be. I just really want to emphasize here that Trent, while he seems really powerful and acts like he is the smartest person in the room, he is not. And my friends made me realize that lewdness totally allows him to think this of himself. So I'm just gonna say it right now. I think it's important to mention to Essek's story arc that finding out that Trent is this stupid and that it's probably actually lewdness calling all of the shots in the Cerberus Assembly and that Trent really has no actual power kind of implies again that lewdness working with Essek is significant to Essek's story and that he might have manipulated him. That out of my system. Anyway, Trent didn't stand a chance. They tie him up and feed him like a baby for the next few days. I'm not even kidding, they clamped a collar on him that stopped him from being able to talk so he couldn't cast, and they feed him like a baby for a few days, and I really wish this was a joke. I really wish I was telling you a joke right now. Anyway, they do this because Trent had Astrid and Aeolwulf set Caduceus' home on fire, which is also a temple to their god, so they had to stay and clean that temple up before they could take Trent to jail in the Empire. While they were doing that though, Essek just kind of hangs out with them. He even gardens. Just kind of fun. So imagine him with cute little gardening gloves on and a funny hat. However, once the Mighty Nine is ready to leave and take Trent back to the Empire, Essek feels like it's too dangerous for him to go with them, so he actually goes back to the outpost in Aeor. There's a very sweet goodbye scene between him and the Mighty Nine before this happens, which definitely sent all of the Shadowgast shippers into a frenzy because Caleb kisses him on the cheek before he leaves. So the thing is that most people in fandoms are used to queer relationships being treated like Destiel is treated in Supernatural, where you might get a confession, but it's always going to be one-sided and they're never actually going to get together and one of them is going to get sent to super hell for being gay or something. God, how did they think that was where were their sensitivity readers on that one? Anyway, Supernatural aside, whenever Caleb was actively affectionate with Essek, I think a lot of shippers had those I have been betrayed goggles on. So when Caleb kisses him on the, everyone kind of freaked out, and then Essek leaves, and a lot of people were very upset that they didn't ask him to like stay or insist that he stays. But here's the thing, I think they trusted Essek to know what was best for him in that situation. And like, it's significant because none of them like roll to try and convince him or anything like that. Also, they were kind of rushed, so like prolonging the scene by rolling might have been part of the reason they didn't do it. But when it comes down to it, I think this was the right choice for Essek, at least in my opinion, and having him have a very solid goodbye with the Mighty Nine right after he's been through everything with them was really, really helpful in my opinion. But also, Essek says a lot about how the Mighty Nine have changed him, and he also thanks them for everything that they've done for him, and it really just hits on a lot of the things we've already talked about in this video. I say we as if I'm not the only one talking. It's the royal we. Also, Essek seems genuinely sad to leave them, even though he seems to know that it's the right thing to do. And actually, one of my favorite 2 lines from the finale comes out of this scene when Essek is talking to Bo.
This world was so much easier when it was black and white.
It's so much more beautiful in all the shades of colors.
Also, talk about character growth, Jester actually asks to hug Essek in this scene, and also Essek says yes. Well, kind of. He's a little like peer pressured into it, but it does seem like he would have said yes. After this, Essek explains that he's going to make his way back to Eor and the outpost, mentioning that he might spend some time in Uthadern, which is another city that's far up north where the Mighty Nine has another friend named Rini, who was far and beyond one of my favorite guests that they had on during the campaign. She was played by Mika Burton, and she was perfect. I also want to stop here and briefly mention what Yasha says to Essek before he leaves, because I've largely left Yasha out to this point, but she's another character in the Mighty Nine that's been kind of on a, well, how she puts it is a penance journey. And really, I want to point this out just because I think it's another good reminder that Essek's journey isn't done. I'll admit, one of the saddest things about the campaign ending where it did is the fact that we didn't get to see more of Essek's journey. And to an extent, we didn't get to see more of Caleb's or even more of Yasha's. And to an extent, while this is the end of Yasha's journey, I think it's kind of the beginning of both Caleb and Essek still. And while I would say that Caleb's definitely further along in his journey, I think there's definitely an argument to be made that Caleb is still taking his first steps towards his full-on redemption. But also, I understand why they ended the campaign where they did. However, something I want to call out is what Yasha actually says to Essek, which is to not take too long beating himself up over what he did. Now, initially this might sound a bit contrary to what I've been talking about. Something that I think really works in Essek's storyline is that it is really slow. But Yasha goes on to say that connection is what saves us, meaning people like her and Essek, or at least that's how I interpreted it. And so I don't think that Yasha was necessarily telling Essek to forget or to work through everything faster. I think what she was trying to imply was that the sooner he lets people in, the better he'll be. And I think based on everything that Essek's been through and kind of how Matt implies his life was before the Mighty Nine walked into it, I think she's right about that. Essek thought he didn't need interpersonal connection, but he desperately needs it. And thankfully he does have the Mighty Nine for that, but especially Caleb. Sorry, I couldn't resist. But Essek leaves, making his way back to the outpost in Eor, while the Mighty Nine deals with a lot of their everything else. Okay, so now we need to talk about the Teledoc. Again, I promise I didn't just like mix up the footage.
How do you do it? I will help you.
Now, we do get confirmation that Essek returns to Eor eventually, and in Caleb's epilogue, we get some key scenes between the two of them. I want to say right now, one of the things that I didn't like about the finale being done the way that it was, is that to me, it made the epilogues feel incredibly short and lack a certain amount of detail that I really would have liked after seeing these characters go through so much over the course of a 3-year-long campaign. However, I will admit I have not seen the finale of Campaign 1, so I'm not sure if this was a normal amount of time that they each got or not. My point here is that Essek doesn't really get an epilogue because he's not a player character, and instead is just kind of an aside in Caleb's epilogue. And Caleb's epilogue is kind of short. It's no shorter than anyone else's, but it's sadly short, at least in my opinion. Liam O'Brien also went like dead last, so this happened at like 3 in the morning for him. However, Caleb keeps in close contact with Essek until Essek is planning to leave the outpost in Eor because people in the dynasty are beginning to realize that he might have had something to do with the beacons being stolen. When this happens, Caleb meets him in Eor with the intention of going back the way they said they would so they can research and study what's down there. Eventually, they return to the Teledoc where they genuinely discuss the possibility of getting it to work so that Caleb can go back in time and stop his parents from being killed. Which is a lot, honestly. Caleb's dealing with a lot of his emotional trauma, and honestly, when you go back to the first time that they were in the Teledoc, they found papers saying that people who were sent back in time often never returned at all, and they did not explain why. You don't know if they just like died or something. It felt like it was implying that they died, but that could just be me. Anyway, Essek, because he's a good friend and also, I think because he has feelings for Caleb, offers to help Caleb do this. There really isn't any hesitation in Essek. He will help Caleb do this. And Essek agrees to help Caleb knowing that Caleb might never come back, and this might result in Essek never seeing Caleb again. And honestly, this whole thing is a show of selflessness that we haven't really seen from Essek yet. Like, he put his life on the line for the Mighty Nine, but in this scene, even when he knows that Caleb might be flying too close to the sun, ready to die if it means achieving his goals, Essek still agrees to help him with it. Despite the fact that when they were in the tower, Essek emphatically told Caleb that he would be a guidepost for him and act as a voice of reason. He seems to be going back on that, at least to some extent, in this scene. Arguably, it also feels a bit like he lets Caleb come to the conclusion that it's not worth the risk on his own and then validates that choice. But in my opinion, it can kind of be both. Like, he can both be going back on what he said earlier and also trying to get Caleb to come to the conclusion that he's flying too close to the sun. For me, this whole scene comes back to just how crucial his relationship with Caleb is to his redemption. Because while Liam O'Brien went on to basically say that Essek and Caleb have a romantic relationship sometime in the future because they both still need time to grow and heal, this moment still comes across like a confession of love. That Essek was basically standing there and telling Caleb that he loved Caleb enough that he'd give him up if that's what Caleb wanted. Again, while we know that this is improv, it felt very intentional that this whole scene felt very similar to their discussion in the tower. The thinly veiled care and desperate need for each other is all there despite the fact that they're not discussing it directly. And this scene is consistent with any time either of them have reassured each other that they're better than they seem to themselves. This theme that what's holding both Essek and Caleb most accountable is their own guilt makes their stories not only feel more realistic, but their redemption arcs more powerful. After this, the last we hear of Essek is that he finds a way to live in the world despite being on the run. He's implied to have a romantic relationship with Caleb, and while Liam O'Brien implied that they might break up at some point since Caleb would be getting old and Essek would still look like a young person because he's an elf, I get the feeling that based on Matt's tweets that likely didn't go quite like that. So honestly, I think I want to start this by saying, if you're still here, thank you! I can't believe this wound up being so long, but also at the same time I totally can because Critical Role Campaign 2 was like 500 hours worth of content. Anyway, that being said, I think what I love so much about Essek's redemption arc throughout Campaign 2 is while it's complex and realistic, it's also not finished. It has all of the pieces of a strong redemption arc, personal reflection, taking responsibility, even learning to care for other people other than yourself, but I liked that it never felt like it was trying to prove anything or change what Essek did in the past, even when some of his past actions are recontextualized. Obviously, I care deeply about Essek as a character, someone who obviously felt ostracized from others and spent a lot of his time alone, which resulted in him becoming cold towards relationships, is something I think a lot of people can identify with. Like, here's the thing, is Essek perfect? Absolutely not. Is his story round and definite? Also no. But I think that's what made it so good. Redemption arcs don't always have to be about a person becoming an entirely new being. They can also be about them learning from their mistakes, growing, and never repeating the issues of their past. Because of that, I think Essek's redemption arc is easily one of the best we've seen in fiction in years, and it still completely blows my mind that it was entirely improv. Like, yes, Critical Role probably talks behind the scenes a little bit about what they want to do with certain characters, but the majority of what went on was all because of decisions that they made in the moment. And that's really, really cool. And also, that is the end of my script, and oh my god. So just for anyone who has not been following me on TikTok, this script wound up being 36 pages in total, and holy crap was this a lot of writing. I'm sure that this video is going to end up being super long too with all of the clips I want to include, so if you made it to the end, I really, really appreciate it. Honestly, I am so thankful for you being here. Here are other places you can follow me if you're interested, and also I am going to do a word of the day on this video. If you made it to the end, please jump down into the comments and just post Shadowgast Nation. That would really help engagement for me, and also it lets me know that you made it this far into the video, which is really cool, and I will give you clout for it. Anyway, I want to say a huge thank you to any and all artists who helped me with this project. I need to give a shout out to Shadow Cypher on Twitter and TikTok. He was the one who put me into contact with a lot of the artists. Also, the littlest goblin who made the Essek Supercut videos, I think I am at least 100 of those views by now. So thank you so much. You have no idea how much easier your videos made my making this video. Also, I want to thank all of my friends and all of my followers on TikTok who were really encouraging throughout the writing, editing, and general wildness of this project. There were a lot of you who were just like super excited and were always willing to hype me up in the comments, and that really helped. I also want to give a special thank you to Aravir and DC Keys on TikTok. They're two of my mutuals who have honestly just been super supportive, and also were always there to kind of be sounding boards. And honestly, by the time this video goes up, I will probably have run a couple of sessions of the Wildmount campaign I'm running for the two of them and a couple of other friends, so big shout out to them. And as always with projects like this, thank you so much to my friend Molly for helping me out with the editing. She is at Sherman Says on TikTok. I feel like she's gonna be like, why did you shout me out? I don't make TikToks about any of these things, but I'm gonna shout her out anyway. For being supportive, guys. I really love doing this for you and being able to find a way to have more of a community around me while I'm doing it, because I think that really helped with this project and will probably help me with future projects. So I think that's it. Thanks, guys. I hope you all find your one wizard soon, or something sappy like that. I don't know, the ending of this is gonna be cheesy. I'm gonna leave now. Bye.